I'm sorry to interrupt so many wonderful, intense conversations that are going on, but we do want to start. And I'm Jan Drucker from the Child Development Institute. I want to welcome you on behalf of CDI and Sarah Lawrence to this annual Thomas Wright Lecture, which was funded by the Leon Lowenstein Foundation to honor Tom Wright, who was our board chair and a chair of their board, and his choice was to have something, a child development resource supported by their gift. And so we thought about a lot of different things we might do, and we decided that to make it a small endowed fund that would allow us to do something every year that would bring us together with all of you for thinking about things of importance to children's lives. Many of you have been here to previous of these Wright lectures or to the Longfellow lectures in the spring. And this year we're very fortunate to have as a speaker someone who has actually had several parts of her career in different areas and who combines them in a really interesting way, including in her recently published New York Times best-selling book called The Importance of Being Little. And afterwards, there'll be some books outside if you want to see them, and she would be happy to sign them if you would like. But Erika Christakis seems to me, although I've just met her, to be someone who has drawn from each of her areas of study and professional work very important aspects of ways of thinking and knowledge bases that can be combined in thinking about children and their needs and our current society. She studied social anthropology as an undergraduate at Harvard, and then went into the field of public health and received a master's of public health from Johns Hopkins, and did a lot of work on, I think both domestically and in Africa, about issues of public health and how education and public health intersected. Some of her work was about HIV awareness, and but from the public health perspective, within her work, I think probably she was already focused in some ways on how people learn and develop their attitudes about things, and of course the impact on children of various health situations. Then later, 20 years ago, she got, there was a second master's in communications from the University of Pennsylvania, which tied in with the public health work and writing about it. And she's done a great deal of writing in various forums about parenting, but many other things as well. And then her third master's, and the one of most direct relevance today, was from Lesley University and was in early childhood education, and she became a teacher. And for 20 years now, she's been probably still a social anthropologist of the classroom, and because after all, anthropology, we've come to understand, is not about them, it's about us too, that we also have a culture, each of us and all of us together. But what happens in education, what happens in classrooms, what children need from a developmental perspective, what is helpful for parents, helpful ways for parents to think about children, for teachers to think about children, and as her book is subtitled, What Children Need from Adults. One of her, in addition to her book, I would strongly recommend that you Google and find a CNN.com article that she wrote maybe 5 years ago, at the time when the Tiger Mother, you remember that, book had come out, and everybody was having strong reactions to it one way or another. And Erika wrote this beautiful piece on being a dolphin mother. And she used I'm not sure how much actual marine biology was involved in that, but to my ear it rang true. But it was a wonderful metaphor, because dolphins are highly intelligent, and presumably their parenting would be also. And she described the many ways that, as a dolphin mother, one might help one's child learn to swim close by first, and then increasingly moving along, and with the right balance of risk and protection and so on. So I recommend that as a wise but also very enjoyable article. So we're really excited to have Erika here. She's going to speak to us and then take some questions from you guys. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. Can everyone hear me in the back? Okay, great. If you can't hear me for some reason, just give a shout or wave your hand. And thank you to the CDI and to Sarah Lawrence. It's a huge honor to be here, particularly on a beautiful summer afternoon. I must say that I wouldn't have been surprised if this hall were empty. It's hard to come out on a summer afternoon, so thank you so much. I'm here to talk today about my book, The Importance of Being Little, What Preschoolers Need from Grown-ups. But really what I want to speak to you about comes from my heart, from my experience as an educator and also as a parent. And I'm just curious, before I get started, how many in the group are teachers? Okay. And how many of you are parents or who have played some role personally in caring for young children? So you represent two of the most sort of misunderstood categories of people in the United States today, I think, parents and teachers. We feel, I wear both hats myself, and I think we often feel very embattled and misunderstood. So my number one goal today is for you to feel a little bit better when you leave than you do now. I'm not saying you don't feel great now, but I'm just saying that we really want to, my goal is to have you leave here with some sense of hope and control. So if that doesn't happen in the course of my talk, then I hope during the Q&A we can fix that for you. So let me just, excuse me while there we go. So who recognizes the infamous, ubiquitous Thanksgiving turkey? Does everybody know what this is? The hand tracing. Who did one of these when you were a kid? Virtually everyone, if you were raised in the United States, did a Thanksgiving turkey. I like to start with this because I think it just it's so emblematic of a prevailing view of young children. We are cued culturally and from our own personal history to look at certain types of images like this kind of a craft, and we immediately think about early childhood. And what I'd like to do is suggest that that is one rather narrow way of understanding children. But I think the fact that we all immediately recognize and remember that we did such an activity, it gives us a clue into why it's sometimes so hard to see children for who they are. Because we've really bought into, even subconsciously, and even when we reject it, we've bought into a kind of very fixed and strong prevailing norm about early education, which tends to, well, I won't belabor it yet. But if you were a parent and your child brought home a Thanksgiving turkey, what might you think? You might say, "Oh, how cute," exactly. And that's a word that we use a lot in early education. It's kind of, again, we're cued socially and emotionally to respond with the word cute. Now, imagine if instead of getting the Thanksgiving turkey, your child brought home this piece of art. A little disappointed, maybe? No? Okay, that's fair. So this is another image of a child. This is actually a piece of work that a young child did, and I'm just going to read you a very brief excerpt about what this child was up to. His name is Trevor, and he was in my preschool classroom a number of years ago. He said, "This is Tyrannosaurus rex meat, and you better watch out because it's not a stinct. Yeah, it's real blood. These are bones and tendons, and the T-Rex is a meat eater, and he's the bad guy, and he's going to chase everyone because I'm always fighting the T-Rex in my room, and it's got a big head with teeth that got dug up by a scientist who's going to give me and my brother some bones and some tools." This goes on and on for several pages. You can read the whole monologue, or dialogue, actually. But there's a lot that we can learn from an image like this, which is really in contrast to the kind of cookie cutter work that we see so often in early childhood classrooms. Now, I wrote this book to solve a puzzle, and it really is the puzzle of the Thanksgiving turkey and the T-Rex meat. It's what I call the preschool paradox, which is, why is it that children are so powerful? They're hardwired to learn in so many different environments. In fact, Alison Gopnik, a famous cognitive scientist, has written very compellingly about the extraordinary powers, cognitive powers of young children. And she's really challenged us to rethink childhood and has demonstrated in her laboratory, she's one of many scientists who've done this, that children are actually superior in their thinking processes in certain ways compared to adults. It's not just that they're mini-me's who need to be carefully nurtured and brought up to become adults. They actually excel and surpass some of our own cognitive capacities in terms of problem solving and creativity. So why is it that kids who are so bright and so capable often struggle, especially in school? And this paradox really was sort of bedeviling me, and I kept noticing it and wondering about it, and wondering what is behind this paradox. And as you see, there are some additional questions that I had that I put up there. It seems to me that children are working harder in schools. And when I say school, I'm using that loosely, but I mean the early childhood environment, kindergarten, preschool, daycare centers, and so on. Kids seem to be spinning their wheels and working harder, and yet somehow the essence of childhood, which is discovery and openness and creativity, that somehow seems to be less obvious to us. And then the other paradox is that kids are omnipresent in some ways compared to previous generations, and yet they're very hard to see. We miss a lot about childhood. We see kids out at restaurants late at night. We see them in places that they might not have been found in earlier generations, and we think that we know everything about childhood, but actually family sizes are smaller. We spend less time with children in some ways, although that actually isn't entirely true, because some studies have shown that we spend a lot of time with kids, but we aren't always attuned to children. And so that paradox that kids are visible and yet somehow invisible. I wanted to unpack a lot of those questions about why it is that we look at the Thanksgiving turkey drawing and that somehow resonates with us, and yet a big blob of ink on a paper is often harder for us to relate to. And I just want to say that this paradox is, it's not just a figment of my imagination. I think we do have hard evidence that there is something going on. And I'll just throw out a few pieces of evidence. Right now, we have almost 3/4 of 4-year-olds in institutional care, and so we have a real responsibility to make sure that children at home and in these care situations are thriving. We have, unfortunately, a growing problem of preschool expulsion. Is anyone aware of this? It's a real equity problem because we have kids from high-risk environments, lower-income children, children of color who are at particular risk for preschool expulsion. The rate of, I mean, people think it's an oxymoron. They think it's a joke when I talk about preschool expulsion, but it's really a really big problem. And it gets at, I will argue, at this paradox of why kids who are so capable run into such trouble. And as we all know from reading headlines or from being in a classroom, we have more and more kids who are on medication or who have earlier and earlier diagnoses of behavioral problems. I think we also have a growing body of evidence that parents themselves are really stressed. And I think parents are really demonized, but it's not easy to be a parent in today's world. So we need to figure out this paradox. Now, why do I have a bat up here? When I was writing my book, I stumbled entirely accidentally on a famous in the academic world, a famous essay called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat" by Thomas Nagel, who was a philosopher. I think it was in about the early 1970s. And his argument was that we can learn all about the individual constituent parts of being a bat. You know, we can understand echolocation and their wings and their big ears, but we never really are going to get close to knowing what it is like to be a bat because we're not bats. It's a little bit of a depressing message, but I think once we accept it, it can be liberating. I would like to argue that we can't really know what it is like to be a child. For one thing, we don't remember our early childhood very well. But I think that we have to try as hard as we can to understand what it is like to be a young child. And that's really what I would ask of you right now, is to just think carefully about, you know, how close can we get? And not to beat a dead horse here, and I don't want to be too unfair to the Thanksgiving turkey, but the more we can really understand what it is like to be a young child, the more we can see the young child, I think the better our children will be. So one way to get close to what it means to be a young child is to understand and see the child. There's a wonderful theoretical framework for this. How many of you are familiar with Vygotsky? Okay, so a lot of hands here. There are a lot of different ways to understand Vygotskyan theory, but I think the simplest way to understand it is this notion that adults play a really central role in helping children, in facilitating or scaffolding, to use the overused word, to scaffold their experiences. And by that I mean it's a way of seeing the caregiver as the person who can kind of close the gap between what a child can do on her own and what she can do with the right kind of support. You know, the way I look at it is that if you give a child if you have a 3-year-old who is thirsty, you could give the child a sippy cup, which would be kind of a babyish thing to do, or you could just say, yeah, go help yourself to a highball glass, you know, go climb up on the cabinet in the dining room. But there's somewhere in between that where the caregiver has a very important role in helping the child to help herself. And it's really what I call the sweet spot for learning. The sweet spot for learning. It's sort of, the fancy word, as you all know, is the zone of proximal development. But I think it's really identifying where the child is, developmentally, emotionally, in their relationships. And the reason that's so important, and forgive me if I'm stating the obvious, is that when we aren't in the zone with a child, when we miss that sweet spot for learning, we're missing incredible opportunities for growth. And I think that we need to really work harder to create environments where that sweet spot for learning is possible. A classic example of not being in the zone is something we call calendar time. Okay, Now, I am guilty of having done calendar time in my classroom, and I've become sort of an anti-calendar time zealot. I don't want to put people on the spot, and I really don't. I mean this very genuinely. I don't want to make people feel bad. But it turns out, according to one study that I read, that after a whole year of tracking the daily calendar, so we all know what this means. Today is Monday, point to the day we're on. After a whole year of calendar work, 50% of the children don't know what day they're on. Now, there are two problems here. I mean, it's a sort of mismatch because it's what I would call a too hard, too easy problem. You know, there are lots of things that we do with children that are not in their learning zone. In the case of calendar time, it is literally too hard, but it's also kind of boring and silly. Because in fact, we don't need 4-year-olds to know what day they're on. We need them to understand the concept of patterns, the concept of number. We need them to understand their relationship to others, the idea that someone is having a birthday celebration, or someone's going on vacation, or someone's family is having a new baby. We want them to have a sense of time and place, but actually knowing that it's July, I don't even know what date it is today. I think it's the 11th. And so that, to me, calendar time seemed to be kind of the almost archetype of a mismatch between what kids can do and what we think they can do. Something that is both too easy and too hard. Something that really keeps them out of their optimal learning zone. And I see that I've got some people over in this side of the room that know what I'm talking about. But there is evidence that a lot of the things that we do really are not well aimed at that sweet spot for learning. This is a child, I think, who is really in her learning zone. Does anyone want to just throw out, and please don't be shy, any evidence for my assertion that this child might be in her optimal learning zone? The sign, yep. This is a little girl. I watched her play, and she was very interested in the social aspect of having a grocery store. She was a little bit of a control freak and wanted to sort of take over this area. And so I was helping her to generate some customers. So we came up with the idea that she needed to advertise her wares or she wouldn't get friends to come over. But you can see from the photo that she's worked pretty hard to make that sign. And what else? Any other thoughts? Okay, sorry. Yes.
Are those plastic vegetables?
They are little, they're little plastic, it's hard to see. They're little fruits and vegetables that I don't know where they came from actually in this classroom, but yeah.
She's not looking up. She's not posing for photos.
Exactly, she's very engaged. She's sort of unaware of the photographer. And she's being very intentional and thoughtful. And as you all know, she's integrating multiple learning domains, numeracy, language learning, and of course the social and emotional piece of actually wanting to have customers and trying to present things in a way that would be appealing to others. She also actually made the curtains, which were some kind of medical, like a gauze pad type thing, and she took a dropper and some food coloring and literally just, like an ink blotter, she dropped little drops of purple ink and then it spread. So she made her own curtains, which really impressed me. When we contrast this kind of activity, which reflects engagement and multiple learning domains, it's a very different, I think, to educators, it's quite obvious what's going on. But I can say as a parent myself, it's sometimes not as easy. The learning is not as visible to people who have not been trained. And I think that is where sometimes kids, where we miss those learning zones, we sometimes haven't done a good job of educating ourselves and others about what to look for, what learning really looks like. Now, I want to talk to you in more detail about this kind of learning. I use the metaphor of the childhood habitat. And I use the word habitat very intentionally because I think that we actually have a sort of erosion of habitat, a kind of habitat loss that's really not unlike the habitat loss that we read about in terms of the natural environment and animal extinction and so on. I believe the childhood habitat is under threat. Now, what do I mean by the childhood habitat? Actually, sorry, let me go back. I mean the physical and emotional space in which to be a child. And we'll talk about that in a little bit in more detail. But one of the big features of a healthy childhood habitat is, of course, the existence of robust, varied play. And we really need to kind of wrestle with what play is before we can even talk about the erosion of play. So I came up with a few definitions that really appealed to me, and you may have some of your own, but here are a few of them. The classic, of course, is Tom Sawyer, whatever a body is not obliged to do. And I think it's a great definition, but it actually doesn't quite capture play in its entirety. Then there's the Vygotskian one, which I also think is very moving, the idea of play as a sort of source of and domain for development. The one that I really love, though, is that very bottom one, and that's the operational definition that I've used in my career, which is an intellectual and emotional frame of mind where children come to an agreement with one another that things are not to be taken literally. Does that resonate with you? I think it helps to explain why certain things that as adults we think might be playful often are not playful at all to children. I think I was just talking to someone in the room before we started about some of the activities in classrooms that are often considered playful but really are quite tedious. And also I think it explains how children sharing a ham sandwich could actually be at play. It really is a sort of attitude, and it's an agreement between at least two individuals, one of whom could be an imaginary person I'd like to mention. So this habitat that I'm talking about, the childhood habitat, is really a lot of different things. And this is just a few of my ideas about what constitutes the childhood habitat. But it's really, as I said, the physical and the emotional space in which to discover and to be loved and cared for. And today, I can't talk about the whole childhood habitat, but I would like to focus on three main areas of this habitat. The first is the physical habitat, including, yes?
Back one slide for a second.
I'm sorry?
Am I going back one slide for a second?
Oh, sure. Yeah, and I'm sorry about the very amateur quality of my slides. So it's just it's really just a metaphor for me. And I'm going to talk today about three aspects of the childhood habitat. So the physical, the emotional habitat, and the language habitat. And we'll start with the physical, which includes, of course, classrooms. This is a classroom in a New Haven, Connecticut kindergarten at Calvin Hill School. And I think I had heard that one of the teachers is here today, but I don't know. I don't know if Winnie is here today. This is a classroom where play is taken very seriously. Block play is taken very seriously. Any ideas about why I could make that assertion? Blocks are out there, yeah.
There's several structures.
Large space for the blocks, is that what someone said? Yeah.
It looks like the art is a representation of their buildings that's on the wall.
That's right. Did everybody hear that? The art itself is representational, so they have two-dimensional and three-dimensional work. What you don't see in the photo, I think, at least not very clearly, is that they actually have a book of photos of the different constructions they've done. And what's interesting is it's not just photos from the current year's classroom, but it's a kind of history of the classroom over time. And so kids come to this classroom at the beginning of the year already knowing that there's a block building culture in the classroom. And the reason I want to show you this is because I think sometimes when we look at physical environments, you know, there's sometimes a tendency to minimize the kind of effort and scaffolding and support that goes into fostering this kind of play. And what I'd like to suggest is I think there's a difference between what I call a play impulse in children, which is hardwired and universal, and play know-how. Now, the impulse to play is, it's almost impossible to destroy that, much as it has been tried. If you look historically, even in periods of profound trauma and stress, children have found ways to play, somewhat heartbreakingly. But the play impulse is very much a universal. But play know-how is very different. Now, how many of you as teachers have observed a decline in what I would call the quality of play in your classrooms over a career? Okay, so I'm seeing quite a few hands. I don't think this is just sort of anecdotal. I think the point here is that play takes cultivation. And it takes a habitat that really values the importance of play. And when I say value, I mean we need to give, you know, children the time and the space, but also the validation that it's really important. And so when you see a classroom like this, you know, sometimes the tendency is to say, oh, you know, you must have a couple really great builders in that classroom. And I bet there are a couple of really great builders in that classroom, because I've actually never been in a classroom where there weren't a couple of really great builders. But this is, you make no mistake, this is a classroom with a very profound culture of play. And it takes that know-how, which used to come more naturally when kids had older siblings and they had lots of free time, unsupervised time to play. Now, as educators and parents, we have to do a little bit more of the heavy lifting. Unfortunately, we have to do some of the cultivation so that play can flourish. Here's just another view of the same classroom. And I want to point out that this is not an affluent school. I think sometimes we also assume when we talk about the physical habitat of childhood that, you know, this kind of environment is really only available to certain kinds of kids. And I would really argue strongly that it's not. Now, to say that is not to deny the reality that children of color and children in low-income families are at twice the risk, they have twice the risk of being in classrooms that are rated low quality. And also they're twice as likely to be in classrooms where the primary mode of instruction is so-called direct instruction. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that term. And it's, you know, it's not a terrible thing, but it is a form of instruction which is very top-down and teacher-driven that can inhibit, especially if it's the primary teaching modality, it can really inhibit the kind of discovery that we're talking about, the kind of learning that we're talking about. So it doesn't have to be a sign of affluence, but unfortunately in today's world it often is, and I think that's a real problem. So we're still talking about the physical habitat of childhood. Any just quick reactions to this photo? Too much? Is that what someone said? Busy? I'm sorry, I'm sort of hearing lots of things, so I'm going to try to paraphrase what I'm hearing. A lot of clutter on the walls. There are some interesting studies now showing that visual overstimulation actually can really affect learning outcomes. So there's a lot going on in this room. It has a very academic flavor to it. And I think I would just want to challenge you all that an academic classroom is not always an intellectual or cognitively rich classroom. It might be, but it often is not. They're not the same thing. Interestingly, this is a classroom that was lauded. This teacher won a national award, and in fact, President Obama is in the background of this photo, giving this teacher an award. And I want to be clear that, you know, I think it's very important that we not polarize. and that we not make assumptions. You know, it's possible to be a great teacher in an environment that is not ideal, but nonetheless, and I have no doubt that this teacher is a good teacher, but I do think we can see right away in that physical environment, we can see some warning signals, warning signs. You know, the clutter, the focus on, well, exactly. I was going to sort of lead the witness, but then you did it for me. We don't really get a sense of the children at all in the classroom. Now, I don't know what the rest of the room looks like, but I think that's a pretty good clue. We don't see photographs. We don't see evidence of children's work. We see a lot of pre-academic kind of skill work. And I think that, as we all know, there is more and more evidence that the kind of learning that comes from this type of classroom can be very shallow. Some of you may have heard of a rather troubling study that came out of Tennessee this year, which was a randomized controlled study. That's kind of the gold standard of research, looking at preschool outcomes, comparing a cohort of kids who went to a state-funded preschool program with children who had no preschool at all. And unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because I'm a very big proponent of early education, but unfortunately the results were very damning. The children who had attended the program initially made gains both academically and socially compared to the kids who didn't. So in kindergarten, in the first half of kindergarten, they looked better on a lot of different axes. By the end of kindergarten, the kids who had never gone to the program caught up with them. By second grade, the kids who had attended the program actually did worse, both academically and emotionally. Now, this is really devastating news for proponents of early education. And unfortunately, a lot of people have jumped on this study and said, well, we don't need to do anything for early childhood because, you know, preschool is useless. That's not the message I take from this study, but I do take the message that we have to be really careful when we are measuring outcomes. You know, it may be that these short-term outcomes, like letter and number recall or identification of shapes and colors, you know, those are sort of this holy grail of outcomes research, and really it's a very low bar. I mean, as I like to say, you know, my dog can identify shapes and colors. And really, I'm not being facetious. I mean, we miss a lot. And when you get back to that image of what is it like to be a child, you know, the bat slide that I showed you, it's very easy in this kind of classroom environment to think that we are seeing children's capacities, and we may realize that we're really missing a lot of what kids can do. And also what they can't do, because this is a very busy classroom, I'm guessing. And I'm also guessing that the pacing of this classroom is pretty fast. And so sometimes we miss how stressed children can be. So physical environment also, of course, includes the outdoors. And this is a very typical playground space, which probably doesn't require a lot of explanation. I kind of think it has that hamster cage feel to it a little bit, you know, with the substrate on the ground. I'm old enough to remember, you know, the good old days when actually they weren't such good old days because kids really did get injured, but you know, I remember when slides were really huge, really high. So this is kind of the classic playground in a lot of early childhood settings. And I think, again, getting back to like our inability to see what it is really like to be a child, this sort of cues us emotionally, you know, the primary colors, and it has that cute vibe. But actually, as many of you know, children don't find this kind of play setting very interesting, right? They really don't. It's kind of boring, actually. This is a very simple playground that I discovered in Massachusetts, which has a very different feel. There are no sort of climbing structures. Really, the kids look like laborers. They spend the whole time outside filling little wheelbarrows with rocks and carrying all of those rocks, the thousands and thousands of them, across the playground, and then they bring them back later in the day. That's what they do. And they climb on the stumps, and they have an absolute blast. And they are getting all of the things they need. They dig for worms. They look at trees. They study things. They enjoy each other's company. And they actually don't need a lot of support from their teachers. But this is an area where the physical habitat can be misleading for people who are not skilled or knowledgeable about child development. It can look like a little bit of a downer. You know, well, where are the monkey bars? Where's the slide? Where's the cute climbing structure? It takes a certain confidence, I think, to create a space like that. This is a preschool in Finland, which I visited last year. Now, I know we're probably sick of hearing about Finland. And I vowed I would not bore you with conversations about Finland, but then I just couldn't resist. Because it actually is true, you know, having been to preschools there, it really is as great as everyone says. And I just thought this was really fun because this is a school outside of Helsinki that was designed with input from children. And the reason it looks the way it does is because the architect met with groups of children and gave them Legos to help design the building. And so then when it came to actually create the building, the architects decided, why don't we just really respect the children? You know, they've been thinking about it in terms of these colored Legos, so we'll make the building look like their model. And to me, that shows an extraordinary respect for children at a very high level and a very comprehensive kind of societal level, which I thought was really amazing. Just a few more things. You know, there's not much to say about this, but just that this is the prevailing norm in the United States. I've visited many, probably hundreds of preschools, and this really is the kind of work that we see. And it doesn't mean that teachers are terrible people, but we're not seeing the individuality of the child. Also, just a shout out here about the, or not really a shout out, the opposite of a shout out. You know, the letter of the week curriculum, which is what this is representing, it's a very inefficient and very limiting way of teaching kids. And it takes a long time. It takes many weeks to get through the alphabet when you're doing that. This is a very particularly uninspiring example of what I call the naming and labeling curriculum, which really, again, sort of ignores children's capacities. This is a curriculum for kindergarten on space exploration. And, you know, space is kind of an interesting thing because kids are interested in space, but it's very abstract. It's very hard to understand. It's very hard for me to understand. You know, I imagine you too, you know, when we hear about space exploration, it takes a lot of brain power to really understand what space is really about. And it's puzzling to me sometimes that so many early childhood classrooms build curriculum around space. That's something that maybe you can tell me more about. But anyway, I think what's interesting about this is that it is so shallow. It's a kind of naming and labeling curriculum, which is asking for shallow recall. But it's also just very inaccurate if you read what they're saying here. Stars are different colors and sizes. Stars are hot, color of the stars. They are far away, blue, orange, red, yellow, white. I'm not sure what this really tells us about space, and it certainly doesn't tell us much about a child's understanding of the universe. Now, contrast that with the kind of conversations that I know you've all had with children, where they really do have deep metaphysical thoughts on a daily basis, and they ask very, very meaningful and humbling kinds of questions about the meaning of life. You certainly don't see it in those worksheets. And just another, you know, the All About Me curriculum is also, you know, it's often very scripted, it's often very commercial, and doesn't really help us understand. You know, if you think about the goal of an All About Me unit, It's to get to know the child's family, the child's culture, and it's to help that child get to know his or her peers in the same way. But sometimes we find ourselves asking, what is your favorite ice cream flavor, or what is your favorite TV show? And those are kind of reflexive questions that we are sort of primed to ask, when really a deeper exploration of relationships is what we need to be doing, because children learn through relationships. They learn through discovery and relationships. Just one more example of the physical environment is I've been doing a review of a lot of the most popular curriculum, and this one is, and when I say, I mean sort of curriculum in a box, or a canned curriculum. And I know many programs use different things. I know some people use creative curriculum, and there's some others that are on the market of varying quality. But I really want to get into the mindset of a child and look at some of these categories, which are really, they're actually puzzling when you think about what captures children's attention. Elephants, hippos, and giraffes. I mean, why those three animals? What about zebras or lions, or, bigger questions about physical habitats, about animal communities. Rain and snow is different than sun and clouds. Well, that's very weird to me. I looked at one curriculum that I reviewed recently, which had a question of the day. And on a Monday, the question was, have you ever been happy? And on the Tuesday, the question was, have you ever been sad? Now, that's just not how human beings think about their emotions. We'll talk about that in a moment. But getting back to content here, and this idea of a naming and labeling curriculum, is that clear what I'm getting at here? It's this sort of shallow mastery of content, which is really a losing proposition in a world where we have content at our fingertips. We don't have to worry that young children will not have facts available to them. That's not the concern. That's not the challenge. What we do need to worry about is, can they engage in relationships? Can they talk to each other? Can they think through problems, tough problems? And I don't think learning about root vegetables as a theme is necessarily the way to do that. Now, that does not mean that you can't have a root vegetable curriculum, but I think it does suggest that it would need to be connected to some kind of meaningful experience, and not just, okay, it's February 7th, so we're going to study turnips. Now, I think it's important because it's easy to get a little bit snarky about the childhood, the physical habitat, particularly in classrooms. We have to understand, though, that there is a whole world beyond the classroom. This is Lakeshore Learning, which is one of the big purveyors of stuff. And, I've bought things there. In fact, when I first became certified as a teacher, I was so excited, and a family member gave me a gift certificate, and she said, I want to get you some teacher supplies. And I said, oh, can I have a gift certificate to Lakeshore Learning? And I went and bought all of this schlocky stuff because I really thought, I'm a teacher now, and I want these things. But I think when you actually look, I went to the store because there's now one near where I live in New Haven, and they're now marketing directly to families. So there's a lot of anxiety, and there are a lot of things they're pitching to families in terms of buying workbooks to do over the summer and stuff like that. And when you look at it like this, you realize that we are up against very strong cultural forces, strong economic forces. It's not so easy to push back on some of these challenges to children's discovery and optimal learning. But I think that we really have to try harder. Now, the physical habitat is very much connected to children's cognition, and I want to sort of segue a little bit into other areas. But I thought I would just show you this. I call it a cognitive sequence. It's kind of a way of thinking about things that you probably already do with children. But if you think about activities that kids do in classrooms, let's say playing with clay or some kind of modeling clay, Play-Doh, something like that. very often we have an image in our mind, either the Thanksgiving turkey type image or, we want kids to make something. Let's say a coffee mug for the parents. And so we have a product in mind, and we've all heard it's the process, not the product. And we've really, we've heard that a lot. But we're still very outcome focused. Now, when I started teaching, I consulted a friend of mine who had taught my kids, a master teacher at the University of Chicago, lab school in Chicago. And she, when I was setting up my classroom, she said, you have to have clay in your classroom, real clay, not just Play-Doh, real clay, because it's hard to use, it's messy, it's much more challenging. And she said, don't let them make anything until they've really explored clay at length. And I said, okay, so how long should I do that? And I was thinking, 30 minutes. maybe 35 minutes. She said 2 weeks. 2 weeks, she told me. The children should be experimenting with clay, but not making a product. I said, you have got to be kidding me. How could I do that for 2 weeks? I couldn't tolerate her answer. It was too threatening to me. The idea that I would let children actually feel the clay between their fingers, push on it, see what happens when you add water, what happens when you use a tool to scrape, to make little lines in the clay, and then you create slip, and then you attach it. I think that's what you do with clay, so it sticks together. I didn't have confidence in the children, and I didn't have confidence in myself as an educator, as a facilitator, as a coach, as someone who could get those kids into their optimal learning zone. I couldn't tolerate that discomfort. So I gave them 30 minutes. But the thing is, here's the paradox. As you all know, oftentimes when kids are bored or frustrated, it's because they haven't had the time to engage in what they're doing. It's really kind of an irony. And so when we actually dig in and let them struggle, not to make something, but to make meaning, that's when real learning happens. And so that is where this little visual comes from. It's pretty simple, really. But the idea of a cognitive sequence like this is that you can apply it to anything. And it's very freeing because then no matter what your environment is like, no matter what activity you have planned, no matter what your classroom looks like, no matter where you are, if you're outside or if you're indoors, if you have the stuff you want or you don't, you can still create a meaningful experience for a child. They can create the meaningful experience by observing, by questioning, exploring, and reflecting. And it's a feedback loop that you can apply to using clay or to, going to the zoo and you see something new that looks scary. Well, you want to observe first and do some thinking before you jump in. You can apply that cognitive sequence to anything. And I think, when we sort of think about making meaning versus making things, it really does liberate us from some of the environments that I showed you a few minutes ago, where we think the physical environment has to be the fuel source, and that's where we get so hung up on putting all the stuff on the walls. The fuel source it doesn't have to be artificially created. It's in the child's head. Now, I'd like to move to the emotional habitat. And I want to start with a brief story that that comes from my own teaching experience. So I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs from my book. This is the chapter called The Secret Lives of Children, Fear, Fantasy, and the Emotional Appetite. My fantasy about the kind of teacher I was and who my students were evaporated one winter day when my pre-K class at Lincoln Nursery School came upon a snowman that had been constructed hours earlier by a class of younger children. That class was taught by my colleague, Wendy Clicks. In the blink of an eye, the sweet little children in my charge threw themselves upon the snowman. Before I could say a word, they'd gone completely berserk, screaming and flinging chunks of its snowy body in the air, gobbling the snowman's misshapen nose, stamping on its felt hat, snapping its twig arms into pieces. "I'm going to eat you," I heard one of the children cry out. I tried feebly to stop the shark frenzy. But really, it couldn't be stopped. The children looked like cannibals, as a dumbstruck parent volunteer who witnessed the event nervously observed. Looking for a teachable moment and dimly trying to salvage something from the fiasco, I asked the children what had happened. Normally, I could expect some real insights from this crowd. They were smart and they loved to talk, but they stared in silence. Finally, one little boy spoke up. "We were really hungry," he explained. I call this the emotional appetite. And I think one aspect of the children's habitat that has been eroded is to do with emotions and our discomfort with children's emotions. We overestimate kids a lot. And what does this have to do with emotions? Try to remember what it's like to put on a coat. I had an occupational therapist walk through with me the steps, the motor planning steps involved in putting on a coat. And she said there were 19 steps. I don't know, maybe some of you could do it in 17 steps. But the point is that we overtax kids a lot. And when we get back to that mismatch idea and sort of getting out of the optimal learning zone, one of the ways that we're mismatched is that we really overtax kids sort of logistically and practically and physically. And it has an impact on their emotional state. I think one of the ways that we have eroded the emotional habitat is that we make an error in assuming that children's feelings are different than adults, but that their cognition is the same. So we often negotiate with kids, and we give them a lot of lengthy explanations, and we give them a lot of choices. And in fact, as you know, kids really do think differently. They really do. And even though Piaget has been debunked in some respects, and children are capable of more abstract thinking at earlier ages than we had once thought, and so on and so forth, but the reality is they are still, for the most part, quite concrete in their thinking. Their cognition is really different than ours. But their emotions, I would argue, are exactly the same. And I think we often get that reversed. And I don't have to tell a group of New Yorkers what this photo represents, this picture. But children have deep emotional lives, and they express them through play, through fantasy play, and through the expressive arts. And we really can't forget that. Play is often viewed as a kind of release of energy. I often hear teachers talk about recess time. Oh, they need to get their energy out. But sometimes play is a way to focus, to reflect, to make meaning from things that are truly incomprehensible. This is a picture of actually my children from 20 years ago. My daughter has just been given a haircut by her brother. I just want to drive home that children really are different than us. They think differently, but their emotions are the same. Why do you think I'm showing you this as evidence of the thinking differently? Exactly. She thought she could not be seen, and so she's laughing uproariously. She thinks it's so hilarious that she was hiding literally in plain sight. So it's really worth remembering. Again, I know there's been a lot of really sophisticated science that's been done since Piaget's day that has sort of questioned some of the earlier assumptions of young children as being less cognitively capable and so on. And I absolutely don't want to give you the impression otherwise. But nonetheless, they see the world differently. But look at the joy on her face, the joy and the other emotions that children feel that we often really don't attend to. I think particularly in institutional settings. And again, when we get back to the reality that our world has changed, I think in many ways for the better, but more and more kids are spending longer amounts of time away from home. And there is a real desire, obviously, to keep the emotions under control. I understand that, and I know as a former classroom teacher myself, you can't have 20 kids having meltdowns, but I think we really do need to listen more carefully to children's emotions. Now, this photo I could have shared with you a few minutes ago when we were talking about the physical habitat, but I think it gets to the interconnectedness of all the different aspects of the habitat. This is from the Finnish preschool that I showed you. It's actually a room that's a giant clothes dryer. So the whole room is a dryer. The kids are outside all day long, in and out, in and out. And I watched the transitions, and they didn't seem to be fraught because the kids had very long stretches of time outside. And then they came in soaking wet. And I said, how do you get them, what do you do with their wet clothes when you have so many outdoor times? And then she said, let me show you our dryer. And I was looking for the dryer. And then she said, no, the whole room is a dryer. I'm not suggesting that we could ever become Finland, but this is a society that values children's emotional needs, and they're actually putting into practice in a very concrete way how to respond to kids' needs. The language habitat. I think this one is one of the most important and most poorly understood, actually, of all of the aspects of the childhood habitat. And so I want to take a few minutes now to describe that. This is a picture that came from my house. And it's actually a piece of the wall of my son's closet. I'll read it to you. It says, from the bottom up, "My dog is not coming today because it is too snowy. Signed, Lysander." This was my son, who was 5, and we were going to pick up our dog from somebody in downstate Illinois, and there was a blizzard. So we had to postpone the arrival of the puppy. And my little boy was so enraged and so crushed that he grabbed a permanent marker and went and scribbled this note in his closet. Now, I guess because his mother is an early childhood educator, I actually didn't get mad. I thought, this is great. You're illustrating the power of language. Developmental spelling. This is so awesome. And then when we moved from the house, my husband really humored me and actually cut out the slab and had it framed, and then he replastered the wall. So you could argue that we are very dysfunctional parents who enable really bad behavior. But what I'd like you to take from this story is not that, but just the power of language and the way that children express themselves even before they become fully literate. And when you look at the way he signed his name, and he even has this little squiggly kind of flourish with his signature, signed. Do you remember as children where you would write things and you'd write signed, your name? We don't really do that as adults, but there's a lot of power there, and I just want to really spend some time talking about that. As most of you know, right now, we have a kind of iceberg approach to language and literacy, where we're really looking at the tip top of the iceberg and not understanding the huge foundation of oral language and of observation and of embeddedness in relationships that really underpins literacy. So I think in a lot of classrooms today, we just look at the naming and labeling. Can you match a letter to a sound? Can you write a capital letter, a lowercase letter? Those are important skills. I don't mean to discount them. But there's a massive foundation that needs to be built over time, and it starts really early. So what is this image? Has anyone ever seen this before? This is scribbling in 3 languages. You want to take a guess what the languages are? Hebrew, okay. What's the middle one? Yep, Arabic. And English, that's right. Now, I don't know exactly what age these kids are, but they definitely are they have not learned to write. And what's the point here? I mean, the point is that a lot of language learning, a lot of literacy learning is going on way before children really give us signs that they are learning. And it's that, again, I'm sorry to beat a dead horse, but this sort of learning, the optimal learning zone notion that we can miss a lot. We can be very mismatched, asking too much or too little of kids, and we can really miss the learning that is hiding in plain sight. And it's only when you see those three languages together that you think, wow, this is not just scribbling. This reflects observation. It reflects motor control. It reflects pride in culture. It reflects imitation and, a desire to be part of something bigger. It's not just random scribbling. I also want to give you a glimpse of how hard it is to learn to read. So we're going to do a little test here. Just take a minute to read this paragraph. And then I'll translate it for you. So, are you experiencing the joy of reading? Can you make sense of what it says? Yes or no? Sort of and no? It's hard. So this is a text that is would represent 90% accuracy if you were able to read all of the words except for the gibberish words. I don't know if I said that correctly, but there are 100 words in this text, and 10 of them are gibberish. So the reason that's important, let me translate it for you first, and then I'll tell you what I'm getting at here. So it says, in graduate school, I was very surprised to learn that many of my colleagues, all of whom were aspiring or current teachers, had been frustrated by their own reading instruction as children. Some reported that they didn't read extensively as adults and felt anxious when reading out loud to children in class. I wondered how children could be expected to instill a passion for reading, much less be effective teachers, if they didn't have a solid grasp of these skills themselves. I'm not suggesting they didn't know how to read adequately, but they didn't feel comfortable reading, which is equally depressing. So, leaving aside the content, which I think is a real issue, I wanted you to have a feeling for what it's like when we give children text that's too hard. And I would say particularly to parents of young children in the room, I know myself, it's very tempting to make your kid try to read something that's uncomfortable, that's just too hard. Instructional reading level is usually around, what do they say, 97% accuracy, something like that? Or no, I guess that's comfort level, and then instructional level is sort of 94 to 97%, I think. So even this level of confusion is very confusing and very unpleasant. So I just think that we forget, and there's so much societal pressure now. One study came out asking, is kindergarten the new first grade? And the answer was yes, it is. In fact, some people would say it's the new second grade. It's really hard to be an early reader, and we put so many pressures on kids. So don't forget how difficult it is to read. It's the most recent, one of the most recent human endeavors. It's not a natural behavior at all. There are many children who would become highly numerate in an innumerate society, but you can't become literate if you're not in a literate society. I mean, it's a learned behavior, and it's a hard one. And we don't have time for a sort of mechanics of reading session, and probably some of you could teach me a lot about it. But, there's so many different components to reading, and it's very, very hard work. I want to I'm getting towards the end of my talk, but what I like to do is give you some visual kind of inspiration. And so I want to show you some photos of some actual classrooms that I thought did interesting things. Since we're still talking about the language habitat here, when I walked into this classroom, I was a little bit puzzled at first. because my first reaction was, well, why is there all this writing so high up? The kids can't read it, and the children in the class are 3-year-olds. It's a preschool classroom in Massachusetts that's affiliated with a contemporary art museum. It's called the Lincoln Nursery School, which is part of DeCordova Museum. And so the teachers are very skilled artists. And what I thought was really interesting about this was that and it's hard to see the photo, I know, but the things hanging from this high ceiling are actually words that the parents, they're little notes that the parents wrote to the children. And I think other things that the kids said. I can't remember exactly, but observations from the community. And what really struck me was two things. First of all, it was such a great use of this space, this cavernous room that had a really high ceiling. And even though the children can't read the words, and even though they're very high up, it's a way of validating language. And if you contrast that to, the print-rich environment that we hear so much endlessly about, which often can be quite tedious, I thought this was kind of aesthetically and emotionally very arresting. And here's another one where the writing cubbies they're almost illegible. The names. Well, actually, you really can't see that, can you? I'm sorry. But the cubbies are written by the children, so I won't dwell on that too much since you can't see it, I think. But what I liked about this teacher was she was very relaxed about the fact that the children, weren't seeing an adult model of their name. She said, oh, they know who the cubbies belong to. They learn that in just a few days, and they understand that that's the kids' way of writing it, and that there's another more acceptable way. The children all understand how that works. So what can we do to restore the child's habitat? It takes a lot of work, but I think as teachers, as educators, we have an enormously privileged position where we can really work with a family to understand children's hidden powers. I think every teacher has some kind of a shtick, and mine, I realized, was the 5 C's. I started thinking about the values that are important to me, and they all began with the letter C. So I made a slide of them. And it's really very simple. But I think it starts with calibration, and by that I mean this identification of the peak learning zone, really understanding and seeing children as much as we can for who they are. We can't really know what it's like to be a child any more than we can know what it's like to be a bat. Well, maybe a little bit more than what it's like to be a bat. But we can do a lot by using our knowledge of child development and our observations and our relationships to really calibrate and understand where kids are at any given moment. And then the others are fairly self-explanatory. Coaching, also known as scaffolding, communicating, fostering creativity and connection. I think these are all very important things. And I really want to inspire you with some evidence from the research world about the power of teachers. When we look at preschool quality, early education quality, we often focus on structural aspects of quality, things like class size or student-teacher ratios, or the education and credentials of teachers. Those are things that seem to make, intuitively, they seem to make sense as markers of quality. But there's more and more research showing that, in fact, those so-called structural variables are actually less important than what are called process variables, which tend to be more relationship-based kinds of variables. And two that are very powerfully linked to quality are knowledge of child development and an ability to translate that child development into curriculum, and knowledge of the individual child. So it's really knowing children both generically, what is a 3-year-old like, what is a 4-year-old like, and knowing individual children, and that means knowing their families, knowing their culture, knowing where they are in a given moment. Those two things, that generic and specific knowledge, are hugely linked to quality programs. And I think we need to focus more and more on that. And for me, this kind of framework is helpful in getting us to that kind of deep knowledge. So I'm going to just show you a few more sort of visuals, because I think it's, as I said, I think it's sort of fun to really look at living examples of what we're talking about. This is just I thought, a beautiful writing table. And you can't see from the slide, but it's a really sunny classroom. And it really invites children in. This is the preschool that I was telling you about that's affiliated with a museum, and they converted what had been a very shabby little space into a museum space where they actually exhibit their plans and their the different things they're working on and thinking about and playing with. And when I went, they were doing a little museum exhibit of what they were calling shrinkinators. I don't know what a shrinkinator is, but they had very elaborate architectural plans that they had done. And I love this because it really is validating children's work and making it very meaningful. It's literally saying, we, just like the artists at our museum, we want to honor your work. Another studio space. I know it's hard to see these. Can you get at least a little bit of a vibe from some of these? The lighting is really key in here. It's just a very inviting space. I love the simplicity of this. It's a classroom that just, is cozy and warm and soft and inviting. There's nothing fancy about it at all, but it's inviting somehow. This is a really language-rich classroom where kids are accessing books in milk cartons that are, totally accessible. So, a lot of us put out themes. We put out books related to mittens or related to the weather, but many kids don't actually enjoy that. They want to be able to browse, and I think children actually can do that effectively. I also wanted to show you this kind of a picture. I don't know if you can see what she's doing, but she's done a bead pattern on her right, and then she's translating it to 2 dimensions. Even somewhat insipid activities can really be meaningful when kids are engaged. And what I liked about this was that this little girl had been given this bead stringing activity, and she actually came up with the idea of translating it into some other sort of medium. And that gets to this idea of the culture of a classroom and how children can be really, they can become quite sophisticated at sort of managing their classroom culture and knowing, oh, well, this is the kind of thing we do. We'll draw a picture of something we've done. I think kids, we underestimate them. They're really capable of a lot of reflection. Here's another room that I really liked, because the window, if you can see the window between the 2 classrooms, someone just put a sort of frame on it, which really invited a lot of interesting fantasy play. It was just a simple fix that the teacher found this window frame on the street and just added it. Yes.
Okay, so I'm assuming that most of us are licensed for OCFS in New York, and we cannot have that.
I know.
And so I feel like the governing forces that license us are really squashing our abilities to make those creative spaces.
They are, and it's gotten worse and worse. It was really bad when I was a teacher, but I had sort of this, I had kind of an arrangement with the licensor. I think this is where we have to look at the whole habitat of childhood, and that includes one of the little circles on the slide earlier was the norms and regulations and rules. And I don't have an easy answer for that, except to empathize with you. I think it's really a problem, especially in classrooms where people are putting natural materials in the rooms, twigs and branches on walls and things like that. I know that sometimes licensors won't allow fabric on walls, and it's very frustrating, and I think that there is no easy solution, but we have to keep pushing back. We just have to, I don't know, I think that's something that maybe we can talk about maybe after this talk in more detail, but it is a really big challenge. How many of you have, speaking of licensors, animals in your classroom? Yeah, I mean, very fewer and fewer. And, it can be a hassle, and I know with allergies and with cleanliness, but, it's interesting. This classroom that I went to, they have rats. They have multiple rats, and they're dirty and creepy looking, and they're unbelievably social, loving animals. And what's really interesting about this classroom is that the teacher uses the rats as part of her kind of inclusion and diversity curriculum, because the kids have all been programmed to be horrified by rats. By the end of the year, they call themselves the Rat Room. And I'll show you their way of checking in is, can you see this? It's a little set of boxes, and each child has a little tiny rat stuffed animal. And so that's the way they check in the morning. I think it's one of those printers press boxes. Now, if you look at the bottom of this slide, and because you can't really see these slides very well, I mean, there's a lot of rat poop at the bottom of that cage. I was very freaked out, but it is an extraordinary lesson to care for an animal. And that's another area where I think we need to really think about what it is like to be a child, and to kind of maybe push back on some of the conventional wisdom, because we've all bought into this idea that, the classroom has to be very sanitary and that kids have allergies. And obviously, if a child has an allergy to a specific animal, you can't have that animal in the classroom. But I think we're really losing touch with with how children learn. And one of the just incredibly classic ways that children learn is through caring for vulnerable creatures. I'm just going to zip through these because I know you can't really see these, but I wanted you to see that these were 3-year-olds who were drawing pictures of themselves, and then they went to their resource center, which is like a big kind of recycling closet in their school, and made these 3-dimensional representations of themselves. And I was really astounded because they were 3 and 4-year-olds. And I don't know if you can see, because it's hard with the light, but if you look at the legs that are made from these bottles, I mean, they're really uncanny. If you want to come up afterwards, I can show you the photos. They're really uncanny representations of the actual children. But these are children who have the time and the space and the materials, the access to materials, and the validation to do this kind of work. Here's another fun classroom, another one that's, again, the lighting issue that you were talking about with things hanging from the ceiling. We have to push back on this, and I don't know how to do it, but again, we've got 75% of 4-year-olds in the United States in some form of non-family care every day. We have to find a way to make care environments caring, and we can't just, turn them into mini elementary school students. We really have to preserve that habitat. This is a workshop in a classroom, and you can tell when I was talking earlier about the cultivation of play know-how, I think this kind of work represents many years of effort. You don't just kind of put together a workbench or a studio overnight. It takes a lot of time and effort, but it's well worth it. More classrooms that I think invite inquiry and joy and wonder. These are my students at Yale, and the reason I wanted to show you this was that, we all like to play, but children are better at play than 20-year-old Yale students, and I really had to push them, and I was surprised by how sort of hesitant and uncreative they were. And my temptation was to whisk everything away because I thought, okay, this is a flop. I was trying to illustrate all kinds of things in this class, and it didn't work. And then I thought, no, I'm going to do what I do as an early childhood teacher. And so I made them dig in, and I just, I was patient and I waited, and then they started creating amazing things. But it's really important to understand that children are unique in their ability to learn through discovery and exploration. But they need, as Alison Gopnik says, they need protectors, they need people, they need adults to safeguard them while they are going through this exploratory process. And that means protecting their time, their space, their feelings. I also want to tell you a brief story about snowballs. When one of my kids was in school in New England, snowballs were outlawed on the playground because we were told that they were dangerous. We were told that they contained shards of ice that could lacerate people's faces and blind them. I grew up in a cold climate, and this was news to me, that snowballs were really dangerous. And so the kids were a little subversive, and they made snow cubes instead. They did get indoor recess, which is such a bizarre consequence to take away. Well, we won't get into that, but it's a very strange behavior management technique to take away recess. I think we need to make more snow cubes. I think we have to push back. We have to be more subversive. And we need to be willing to pay the price for upsetting parents, maybe upsetting a licensor. Schools are not shut down overnight if they are in violation. I mean, they're not. And, we need to band together. We need to be familiar with research. We need to talk to colleagues. We need to get support. We need to be careful not to demonize parents. It's very easy to just say, oh, the parents don't get it. They're driving this. They want all the worksheets. They want the homework. They want the cutesy crafts. Well, we have to do a better job of explaining to them why there are alternatives. And I really, I don't want to come on too strong here because I'm an advocate for all of you. But as a profession, we need to do better at really translating the research base that's out there and getting it into the classroom. It's really, really important. So it's funny when people ask me, what should I do? I'm so worried about the way childhood has gone, the direction it's taking, the way that early childhood education has gone. And I have sort of two almost diametrically opposed responses. One is stop worrying, because children are so much more intelligent than any of us realize. And if they are nurtured and loved and feel safe, they'll be fine in any setting. That's true, but at the same time, we also have to get active. We have to get agitated and angry, and we need to push back. And I really think it's only going to happen from within. I don't think we're going to wait for laws to change. We have to make the change that we want to see. I'm going to close with one more thing. I talked to you about how we can help children, every child, and particularly our most vulnerable children, to be in their peak learning zone, to be nurtured, to be safe, to explore and discover. It's really hard because we're not children ourselves, and children don't get to vote. There's a lot of misunderstanding between adults and children, and this has always been true. And every generation is confused and frightened of the next generation. The famous essayist George Orwell referred to what he called the lunatic misunderstandings of childhood. A lot of children are completely bewildered by what we do to them, what we ask of them. But I still think there's a lot of reason to be hopeful. And this painting here, I assume you probably can guess who the artist is. It's a Picasso painting, and it's called First Steps. And I love this painting. It's in the Yale Art Gallery. So I have the privilege of seeing this beautiful painting, usually without anyone around, because no one seems to go to the Yale Art Gallery. It's a great museum, and it's free. So why am I showing you this picture? I find this a very moving painting. If you look at the mother, the tenderness of her hands, and the purposefulness of the little boy's feet as he's taking his first steps. But if you look at the mother's face, and I don't know how well you can see it in this light, but does she look, worried? Serious? So Picasso painted this picture in Paris in 1943 during the Nazi occupation. And I think that it's a reminder to me that, parents have always loved their children in any circumstance, even in the most traumatic. And I think it's just a very hopeful thing, because that child has a look of accomplishment. And if you look at that foot, it's really a powerful foot. And the mother is very loving and yet worried. I guess that's just, to me, a sort of symbol of the power of relationships and the power of children and the way that we can really create a safe world for children, and the imperative to do so, even in really challenging situations. So thank you so much for being with me this afternoon. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions. I know I've kept you a long time, so I'm not offended in the slightest if you need to leave, but I'm happy to take some questions, and I'll stick around and talk to people, whatever works for you. Yes?
First, I want to say you had me at calendar time.
Good. Thank you.
If I could, like, you come to the microphone?
Okay, so she said you had me at calendar time.
And if I could, but then my back will be to everybody.
So turn it around and face everybody.
If I could, is it on? No.
Do you want to come up here?
I have a teacher voice.
Okay, or you can come up here.
Here we go. Sam got it for me. Okay, my new buddy. If I could have a decree and say no more calendar time, I just wish I really could do that. I've worked with some centers for 10 years, and I can't get them to get rid of the calendar because we have to prepare them for kindergarten. But the one, you made so many good comments, Erika. I had a reaction to every single one. But the one I just want to comment on was the study that said one of the real indicators of quality was a knowledge of child development.
Yes, yep.
And I don't think we are preparing teachers with enough of that knowledge. I can't speak for what happens here, but I know when I go and visit sites, I can tell in the first 3 minutes by looking at their schedule if they have an understanding of child development.
And the key is to translate the child development into curriculum. So it's really a two-part thing. It's knowing child, because a lot of teachers really do understand children, but there's sort of a missing piece where they're not able to translate that into, for example, opening up a schedule, fixing the transitions, having fewer of them. The calendar time is a good example. There's actually a good alternative to calendar time. Do any of you use just a simple number line in your classes? That's a really effective way if you do want to have some marking of the passage of time. I don't think it's essential, but that's a very effective thing. You don't have to worry about the dates and the days of the week, but it gives a child a sense of number. So there are ways to do that, but you need that knowledge and some training or support to put it into practice.
And I just don't think that they're getting it.
I think you're right.
And you can tell, if they have choice time for 30 minutes,
right.
That says something. If they have art, from 9:30 to 10, or they have circle time for 30 minutes, that tells you right there.
Right.
And so I just think we need to do a better job and to help professionals and early childhood people continue to learn and to change, because we can change.
Yes.
And you shared stories, and I share stories about what I did. So I want to thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for your comment. Thank you. Any other comments?
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Dr. Donna Norton from Madison, Wisconsin, and I've got a question about your emotional part.
Yes.
And I've been reading, our students at the University of Wisconsin and the College of Education are interviewing Latino and Muslim kids right now. And there's 2 words that are coming out in the interviews that we should never hear kids use, and that's fear and hate. The Latino kids are so afraid that their parents are going to be shipped back to Mexico that they say they're afraid to leave the house. The Muslim kids are saying, why does everybody hate me? They're going to drop bombs on me. Why? What can we do for kids? And this was a 5-year-old who said, why do they hate me?
Thank you for that very powerful reminder. It's really kind of stopping me in my tracks because it's so devastating. I think we have to respond to children where they are. And that means that we've got to get away from this canned curriculum kind of model where if it's Tuesday, we're doing pumpkins, and, you know, I'm so sorry that you're worried about a bomb being dropped on your family because actually we have to make our dragon puppets. You know, I mean, I'm caricaturing it, but actually it needs to be caricatured, because I think part of it is we need to be witness to children's pain, and we need to just be willing to tolerate it and to embrace where they are. And that really gets back to this idea of habitat loss. You know, we need to slow down, we need to stop the frenetic pace, and we need to give kids time for fantasy play. I've been rereading Vivian Paley's wonderful books on play, which I'm seeing lots of nodding. I really recommend them if you're not familiar with her work. They're deeply moving. It helps you to understand why rich dramatic play, fantasy play is so central to the development of a strong inner core. Now, that doesn't get at the structural and sort of societal issues that I assume are also part of your question. And, you know, I mean, I don't know what to say about those, but I think that one of the very troubling things that I've learned in my work at Yale at the Ziegler Center for Child Policy and Development, Child Development, the kids who most need a play-based, relationship-based, exploratory kind of curriculum are the ones who are least likely to get it. And by that I mean children in poverty and children facing other stresses, economic and other kinds of stresses in their families. We know that those children are more likely, as I said at the beginning of the talk, to be in classrooms that have the sort of top-down, teacher-driven, scripted kind of curriculum model. And that does not allow for, you know, the kind of emotional care that you're describing that the children need. Thank you very much for saying that.
In what you just said, it's scary that there are systems that are being honored for those top-down. I mean, Eva Moskowitz's Harlem Success Academies are completely venerated in the city, and it seems like they're being replicated more instead of less. And I just don't know. I just wanted you to.
It's a huge mystery to me because people really should know better, and I don't know. I think the people who, you know, it's such a privilege to be here, but, you know, part of the frustration, candidly, is that I'm kind of preaching to the choir, you know, and so we need to figure out how to take what happens in these rooms where everyone's nodding and get it out to the broader world. I'm a big believer in writing op-eds. I think there's more and more space for that. I do think our culture is shifting a little bit. I think we've reached such crazy levels of I mean, I don't know if you call it abusive children, but, you know, we now have treadmill desks in kindergartens. You know, there's a lot of Looney Tune stuff that it just makes no sense. You know, we don't need to give children treadmill desks. We need to get them outside. And I think some of these things are starting to break through in the popular press. And so I think it's actually a ripe time for teachers to get their voices out. It's really hard, though. I wish I had answers. And I do think the training piece and obviously the salary piece are huge, too.
I just wanted to address particularly the professor, but everybody else, if you don't know about it. The Southern Poverty Law Center has materials addressing specifically those issues. So you might want to splc.org. And they have a magazine, Teaching Tolerance, and they have a website with lots of different materials. So,
thank you. That's wonderful. You know, the Center for the Developing Child, I think, at Harvard has some really interesting and sort of, you know, short format kind of working papers on the effects of trauma on learning and on the developing brain. And so if you need those resources just to kind of understand what's going on and then to have the resources that you've described to actually take action in your classroom, that's very helpful. I don't need to tell you, you know, the percentage of kids especially those living in poverty, who've actually personally witnessed violence in their homes, including murder, and it's shockingly high, and we aren't well equipped to deal with that. I don't want to keep you too late. I'm happy to stick around. Maybe take another, maybe one more question, and then I'll just be here.
How is music play an important part in early childhood education?
Are you asking about music? How does music help children? One of my many, many regrets of things I didn't address in my book, and someone once said that books are abandoned. They're not finished. They're just abandoned when you write a book. I didn't tackle music, which I think is a huge part of early childhood. I don't know if anyone else would like to answer that question, but one thing I have observed is our discomfort as American teachers with singing and using music in the classroom. I think we still see it as kind of like a special, is that your experience as well? And it's been striking to me in contrast. I've seen a lot of early childhood settings in other countries and other cultures, and it's different. I think I don't know, there's some resistance, I think, but I mean, music is essential. I don't know if anyone else wants to answer that in a more sophisticated way.
I had a director who came from a music background, and she really encouraged us to use music in the classroom, which is great for me because once my kids got over the age of 4, they wouldn't listen to me sing anymore. But it was particularly useful in terms of transitions.
Yes.
Because we would sing, We Are the Dinosaurs when we were going down the hall. And I'm just thinking about schools where I had previously worked in a school where it was an elementary school, but the big thing was being quiet in the hall. And the kids, they just loved singing in the hall, going from place to place. And, we would put their names in the songs, and it was great.
And that really gets at a bigger issue, which is our need for control of children. And, a lot of these norms that we accept about schooling have to be rethought. And I think particularly with more and more younger children spending more and more time away from home, this idea that everything has to be quiet and that everyone has to be lined up. I'm not saying there should be a free-for-all, but I think we do need to really question some of these norms.
Any questions over here?
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure.